what happens if we stop seeing ourselves as separate from the story of the Earth? And if we could shift our thinking of the planet as something to save and seeing it as something we belong to. And so we discover, new forms of courage and creativity we didn't even know we had. And so who am I? This is the question, I guess. Who am I in this larger living system? Because I believe that once you feel that connection to the earth, to each other, to the work already in the motion, doing something becomes inevitable. And so it's no longer about obligation, it's about belonging.
Welcome to System Catalyst, the show that cracks the code for making the world a better place. I'm your host, English Saul. Today, I am interviewing my dear friend, Ronda Carnegie. Ronda is the executive director and co-founder of Project Dandelion. Project Dandelion is a global women-led climate movement, uplifting those on the front lines of the climate crisis to lead the way forward. Before launching Project Dandelion, Ronda was part of the original executive team at TED, where she helped grow the organization from a single conference into a global media platform. She also founded the TED Institute to surface innovative ideas within organizations and co-founded TED Women, creating powerful spaces to uplift women's stories and leadership around the world. In addition to her work with Project Dandelion, Ronda co-founded Connected Women Leaders and serves on several boards. Her work is woven together by a common thread, using storytelling, community, and leadership to drive social impact. Ronda, it is so great to have you on the show. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me, English. And every time I have a chance to have a conversation with you, the world changes. So I'm so happy to do it.
I've been anticipating you coming for such a long time because we've been in so many exciting and wonderful conversations about Project Dandelion and about the work and the system that you and the rest of the Project Dandelion team is really starting to shape and mold and just, catapult into the world. So I'm really excited to get into it today. I am really curious. We're really centering on this idea of climate justice. And I kind of want to kick off with you talking to me a little bit about what is climate justice? It feels very intense and bold and heavy. And I just want to hear from your words. Why does it mean something to you? And really, what is it for our listeners who are maybe kind of, looking at it as a really ambiguous term?
Yeah, it's such a great question, English, especially right now in the world, we're playing with words, how words are used, when they're used, and in what context. So, for me, and I think for those of us who created Project Dandelion, and when I say it is a coalition around the world, it really became so clear that that with all of the science and technology in the world, we can't help us if people don't feel the story. And that's what we're trying to really protect. So for too long, we've really tried to solve the climate crisis like an engineering problem. And it's as if we can design our way out of this, but you can't heal or even transform what people don't feel connected to. So when people are disconnected from nature, from each other, from their own sense of agency, no amount of data will really move them. So when they feel the sense of belonging, that's when transformation begins. So when we think about climate justice, it's about asking different kinds of questions. So instead of asking, what can we build? We start asking things like, who can we become? Or realizing that because climate justice isn't about cutting emissions, it's about renewing relationships, ones with one another and also ones with the earth. So the question that we are constantly asking people, especially when it comes to climate justice, which says, who are the most impacted And when is how do we speak to people in a way that they want to listen? And it's not what you say or the way you say it. So climate justice feels a little bit like it's that kind of framing, and that we have to look at it with a toolkit with different kinds of ways in, especially when we think about Project Dandelion and its role as a system change catalyst.
I mean, I think that that's really potent. And I really appreciate this emphasis on the relational healing of what you're talking about. And, I read once, and I think it was in association with, more of the Black Lives Matter movement, but has similar ties to what we're talking about. I read that justice only occurs as a response to injustice. And I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit as it pertains to the climate space, and specifically around this idea of what you mean by this relational healing that has to take place, that really is not, not the same as just looking at numbers and saying a solution needs to be enacted.
Yeah. So, I think the climate justice is a story of reconnection. I think that's one of the things that you're speaking to. It is remembering that the earth isn't something out there that needs to be saved, but it's something that we're really a part of. And so when we feel that story well, and we understand that we need to create a climate safe world that is livable for all, that it awakens really the courage and the creativity that this technical solutions can't reach. But if I could, I just want to go back to this idea of how Project Dandelion came about in some way, because it is really a mix of imagination and purpose. And it's really about showing the world what's possible. And this is the seed of Project Dandelion. So when it first began, and you look at Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, Pat Mitchell, who did incredible amount of work in the women's rights movement, and then Hafsat Abiola, who really is a leader from the global South, who is really focused on the role of democracy. You start seeing this idea that we have to create something that can both hold the science and the spirit of the moment. And climate justice is that spirit of the moment. And so we really felt that one of the things that we needed was a symbol that really connected all parts of the system. And so that system is that you have women restoring land and reimagining agriculture, and you have policymakers, you've got funders, you've got storytellers, and everyone's got to work together toward a new world. And so Project Dandelion is really this, narrative wrapper around this idea. It's about connecting people inside systems. It's about mobilizing capital toward women-led solutions and giving voice really to the innovators who are on the front lines, which you talked about in your intro. And it's also about bringing 2 billion people off the sidelines by making the conversation on climate and our shared future way more human, way more hopeful, and more accessible. So what are ways that we're calling for how we as individuals can be in solidarity with others? And then how are we finding frontline solutions? And so I really think about it in many ways that it's really a toolkit, which is about centering leadership and narrative and movement building. And why leadership? So leadership because we need to build people brave enough to imagine beyond the old systems. And we know that women are extraordinary at this. And the narrative, because we know that story is how we remember what matters. And this is where we really see, in order to shift culture, we have to shift this story of the new world. And where do we see that? We see it in places like India, where we see rural women with incredible heat coming up with solutions, and just the innovation. We're shifting this, like, who's innovating, and then movement building, because we know no one can do this alone. So I think that's how we are really imagining the new world, in that we're shifting the story and acknowledging that all the solutions are out there. We are just connecting. One of the things that we say is that we're super good at the hardware piece of climate, not so good at the software piece of it. And that's the human infrastructure piece of it.
Yeah, I think that that's really potent, the sort of the human infrastructure piece. And I think that that's true. I think one of the common threads we've seen, even just articulated on this podcast, is that piece, because it is so vital to systems change. And it's also, I think, the hardest piece to ascribe causality to. But it's almost, I mean, it's so like you feel it. You know it when it's happening because you feel it. And I wonder, Rhonda, can you give me an example of how that's felt within Project Dandelion and within the Project Dandelion community? I mean, I think one of the ways is like the Dandelion pin that you have is a very visual representation of the ripple effect. But what else? Tell me about how you feel that narrative in the communities and in the folks that you're talking with.
One of the things that we think about with Project Dandelion is that we've got to play both what we call the inside game and the outside game. So the inside game is like policymakers, those who are mobilizing capital, people who are looking at it every day. So what are they doing to think about how in which they're mobilizing capital? What are we seeing in terms of policy? And how is that a catalyst for change? But then we've got to play the outside game. And this is how do we bring 3 billion people off the sideline who every day are like, what do you want me to do? What is the role of collective action? So we need to be able to do both. So right now, here's a perfect example. We are getting ready to go to Brazil for COP30. And for your listeners who don't know, that is really where the climate negotiations take place. It's in Brazil. There's been a lot of just controversy about where are countries in this conversation about the larger idea of everything from adaptation. And this year it'll be really about capital finance, really climate finance overall. And what we're seeing is that we are running a campaign about women smallholder farmers. Now, what do we know? We know that women smallholder farmers represent 70% of the food supply in small to medium income countries, and they are anything but small. So we have to shift the way in which we're thinking about the investment of smallholder farmers, and we have to show them as both innovators. And so in this case, we're taking you to both Ethiopia and to India to share stories of innovation. And we are saying that if we really mobilize capital to smallholder farmers, we can add 1 trillion to the GDP. So it's a new way, new language, new way of talking about this, which is calling for investment where investment is smartest. So that's sort of the way in which we're thinking about what are the moments we can come together. And as you said, just even the ritual of the pinning of people who are either in the movement or those who are starting their wayfinding have been, for me, such an insight. It's been incredibly emotional to see how people respond to that.
Yeah, I think that this is a thread that has come up in numerous conversations that you and I have had, and then that we've had with other people in this network when we're talking at people at Women Moving Millions, when we're talking about this at school. What's been hard about this new way of thinking or new way of communicating? Because I think that what we've witnessed is an arc in the climate change conversation of initially, I mean, and this is just my interpretation, but initially we're talking about science. We're talking about like, this is really data heavy, the temperature of the earth or the temperature of this or the air pollution or where, like, there are hard pieces of evidence that are sort of saying this is happening. And now we're realizing that there's more of a movement into, okay, this is happening. Who is this really affecting? And then now it's moving into, okay, who is it affecting? And then who are the people who are actually fighting this in the moments and when and where it's happening, right? Who are the people on the front lines? And I think that there's a whole lot of overlap on who is this affecting and who's fighting the hardest against it. And that nexus seems to center on women. And I really, I would love to understand what about that conversation has been a light bulb moment for you or even other people that you've spoken with, but also like, that also seems like the hardest part is sharing this conversation and sort of saying, here are the people that this is really impacting, and here's how they're fighting against it. And we need to put time, energy, effort, and resources into what they're doing and what they're saying. So how has that been difficult?
Yeah. So I just have to say, one of the things we've learned about Project Dandelion is that collaboration sounds beautiful in theory, but it asks a lot of us. That is, I think, one of the things, especially in a world where people are so tied to their intervention. I think that that's what you're speaking to. And so the hardest part is not the logistical part of this. It's really the humility. And that, really real collaboration means letting go of control. And this in the segment, you and I talk about this. If you are in the climate world, you're like, I'm climate first. If you're in the health work, you're like, I'm climate, but I'm health first. So it's like everyone really is holding on to their language, holding on to their solutions. And we are in not letting go of control. We're still not doing enough listening more than we are speaking. And that part of the hardest thing here still is building trust. And you were saying even among the women's movement, like there's a ton of issues and you hear them on your show. There is a ton of issues going on out there. And so I still believe even in this segment, we are trained to compete, even in the spaces that are meant for common good. And so when you're facing something as big as the climate crisis, no one wins alone. And this is hard. It's hard. And so we are really, I have to say, in the time that we started Project Dandelion, it's really, 3 years old, just watching the evolution of collaboration. I think part of that is just in terms of scarcity that's out there. People have felt like, okay, I guess I'm forced to do that now. So I think also thinking about where there is really a formal agenda. And so it's like also, where are these conversations taking place? Are they happening at dinner or collaboration really has to be at the heart of really moving this forward. It's an act of courage, I think.
Absolutely. And it's courageous to think about a problem in a new way and recognize that, in some ways you're not going to be able to see the fruits of this labor for a very long time. How do you personally deal with kind of the fact that, in any systems change work, we work really, really hard and we know that maybe we're not going to actually see shifts in this for multiple generations, especially when it comes to climate change. How do you think about that?
Yeah, it is something that I do think about a lot. I think partly because when you look at Project Dandelion and you look at Mary Robinson and Pat Mitchell, and as vibrant as they are in their 80s, which is just amazing to me. I often say I can hardly keep up with them. But in their lifetime, when they were in the 60s and they saw a similar shift, right, where we had a reckoning of sorts during that time, and to be now in their life in their 80s and to be back at this cycle and to see that it's even tougher than it was or what it felt it was in the 60s. While also, talking to friends who have been reading incredible history books to try to understand about cycles. Where are we with cycles? How is the generation of the millennials really seeing these kinds of issues? And I know, we talk about that, really English, where you are in your life, just understanding where that cycle is. So I guess the way that I think about it is that, just in the last 2 years, I became a grandmother, which was, really interesting to me. And I see my, 2.5-year-old grandson with his hands in the soil. And I'm very hopeful that history will help us to get through this cycle. We are going through a cycle of an old world and a new world. And I really am thinking, like, what am I doing this for? And also actually knowing, like when I talk to Mary and Pat, that they have been through some of these things. And so you have that perspective of experience about what happened during this time and just seeing what's happening in the world and like being prepared for this moment, but knowing that you are part of the system's change. And as you said, that just takes time.
Yeah. I also think that one thing I've been able to witness you and Project Dandelion doing is learning so astutely from some of these other systems catalyst entities. You know, I know that you've had many conversations with Madeline Ballard, who is also a guest on this podcast with Community Health Impact Coalition. And in a lot of the ways that you're describing the work that is ahead of Project Dandelion, it is really similar also to InFund, which is, you know, we had Ellen Agler, who was the previous CEO of InFund, on this podcast a few seasons back. And I think it's this work of being both a listener, an aggregator, and a compass in a lot of ways, of saying what exists, why does it exist, and how do we orient in a way that illustrates kind of connective tissue. And really the true work of a systems catalyst is like, how do we make sure all of these things are sort of going in the right direction at a similar pace and they're feeding off of each other? And the question that I kind of have in thinking about this is like bearing witness to what you have done and seen. Do you think that there are systems level changes that we actually might be able to witness in this space in our lifetime? Because there are so many people, like you just said, who are really sort of doing a lot of this work now, even if, you know, the masses don't necessarily know. What do you think that we can sort of look forward to, you know, over the next couple of years, and looking at how the system might start moving in this new direction?
Yeah, I think the pressure on the system will be the heat, the storms, some of the things that we're seeing. I mean, I think it's not happening somewhere else. It's happening in people's own backyards. And I do think, you know, when I saw Madeline earlier in the last couple of weeks, you know, really just you can talk about, again, all the tech solutions or what's going on, but these community health workers are on the front lines and they're seeing it and they're experiencing it. So I think it is in the seeing and the experience it that will be both a pressure point and an accelerator. And I guess the question is, for the longest time, we said we didn't want to get beyond 1.5. And here we are, right? So here we are. So, you know, some people have shifted the finish line now to say, well, let's see what happens between 1.5 and 3. Now, we know what's going to happen because the scientists have told us what's going to happen. So we are going to need to have solutions that accelerate. And I think we're seeing, even as we go into this COP, that we've moved the conversation from mitigation to adaptation. We have to really focus. I think the challenge is people don't know how to finance adaptation. And so that is where we really need to understand where that is. So it's like, if we look at the overall system and we see what's there and we see what is the outside accelerant that's going to force us to move forward, then how are we thinking is the best way to create this, as we say, to connect and mobilize together. And that is, I think, exactly as you said, the role of Project Dandelion, to really focus on what that looks like and find that one point that unifies everyone with the dandelion to get there. Like, just in the idea that we're in this shared narrative together, and whether it's professionalizing community health workers or understanding what they need, or tech solutions, that we're all focused on seeing the same information and moving forward.
I want to get back to this point also that you just made around, it's really hard to finance adaptation. And I want to understand a little bit, like, if we were speaking right now to the funders out there who are raising their hands or saying, I want to do that. I want to finance adaptation. I want to finance and fund systems change. I want to come in at this level of, you know, funding entities who want to aggregate, who want to provide, wayfinding, who want to sort of, get into this, systems change, systems catalyst space and fund adaptation. What would you say to those funders? How would you say, yeah, great, let me tell you what to do?
Yeah, well, I think we're hearing from different people on what theories of adaptation is. There's been a lot of interesting dialogue around Bill Gates's letter, right? Around adaptation and funding adaptation and saying like this, again, it comes back to this whole thing, this balance between client, this balance between health. What are we solving for? And again, we know climate's the most intersectional issue of our time. So if we have to face infectious disease, we have to face climate at the same time. So I do think that we are, in our listening, we are hearing some interesting things about adaptation. In a world, old world, new world, we're moving from aid into this new era, which I think plays into the conversation about adaptation. You are seeing funders not continuing to want to fund at the community level, but wanting to understand what kind of catalytic funding looks like at the community level so that people can become innovators locally. So what does that look like if I go in, I innovate, but I'm setting up a system that can stand on its own? This is the new theory. We'll see how that plays itself out in terms of adaptation at the community level. And you're seeing Gates and others rethink about sort of moving toward more of an entrepreneurial model as it relates to community-based funding. But I think that's part of the adaptation. You're also seeing this move from just adaptation as monitoring, because we saw a lot of tech come in and really focus on how are we monitoring the problem, to we're seeing interesting pilots in insurance that we have not seen before, or the creation of cooling centers in places like India where the heat is going to get shifting, or the volatility of supply chain in the private sector. So we're like, we're seeing it on a number of multiple levels, almost like human-based design, to see how those, and we're tracking each of those very carefully to see, yes, we know it has to be the private sector reinvesting in their supply chain, and then just funders in general understanding what community-based funding will look like. What do you think about that, English? What are you hearing in that way?
I mean, I agree. I think that I think it comes back to both kind of like the desire around how to fund in new ways and be okay with that. The first episode of this season featured some good friends of mine, Cedric Dashville and Rachel Markham, and they talked a lot about risk taking in philanthropy and what that looks like. And Rachel had said, she was like, to us it's not risky because this money's already earmarked for philanthropy or for these efforts, and so we're sort of just putting it where it needs to go. And I appreciate that perspective and respect it a lot. And I think that is that's kind of where I think that's where funders sort of need to consider, where is the risk? Is the risk in adaptation? Is it in where we change these things? And also what's short-term risk versus long-term risk, right? The short-term risk is moving towards a new process or funding adaptation with not knowing exactly where impact is going to sit or how impactful it's going to be in the short term. And then the long term is, right, like not doing something and the earth keeps getting hotter. So I think it just sort of, the devil in the details to me sits in where that appetite for risk goes and what that actually means, and also what tools we have to both mitigate that, but also sort of enable more accessibility in that funding process, right? And I think that what I see across the board, I think is more hope and more risk appetite, and I think in philanthropy in general, especially, the Gates Foundation is stepping up and doing even more in that area. I think we see a lot of that. It's more in philanthropy, especially kind of coming off the heels of USAID cuts, right? Philanthropy is trying to say, okay, we've got more work to do here. And I'm excited to see how that momentum keeps going and what people are more and more excited about and open to adapting with and for.
I loved that interview, by the way. I thought it was very interesting, and I just saw Marie also as well. And I think there is this discussion, just adding to that, about the role of the intermediary. And I think that that's one of the things that they're taking on, which is it's not just that people are spending money, but how they're deploying it. That I think is a big issue. And so how are we getting money to the front lines? And then exactly what you're saying. And what is the role of the intermediary in that? And that is a space I'm really going to be watching going forward, especially with that kind of philosophy toward managing a risk portfolio.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Me too. So Rhonda, one sort of question that I love to kind of leave our listeners with as we come to a close is really kind of what question or thought do you have that you want to leave our listeners with, maybe this evening or when they're sitting talking to their friends about recycling plastic bottles. What is it that you kind of want to leave people thinking about or considering after they listen to this episode?
I always love that question when you end with that. It's really one of my favorites. Well, I would say, and this is a little bit about what we talked about, is about what happens if we stop seeing ourselves as separate from the story of the earth. And if we could shift our thinking of the planet as something to save and seeing it as something we belong to. And so we discover, new forms of courage and creativity we didn't even know we had. And so who am I? This is the question, I guess. Who am I in this larger living system? Because I believe that once you feel that connection to the earth, to each other, to the work already in the motion, doing something becomes inevitable. And so it's no longer about obligation, it's about belonging. And so I have to end on the dandelion because everything feels of the dandelion. But if we look at the dandelion, that our ideas, our efforts, and our hope, they travel. Where always blows the seed. And so each seed carries the potential to root something new, somewhere new. And then it's not always where it lands, but more that together we're shaping a field of what can grow, of what is coming next. And so, yes, that's what I would love for the listeners to think about. How are you a dandelion?
I love that. That's really beautiful. I'm really excited to take that on and be thinking about that and considering that as well. So, Rhonda, thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful and inspiring conversation. It's really nice to leave a conversation feeling really hopeful about what can be and how we can take the time and make the effort to build a world in a way that we're excited about being participatory in. And I always leave my conversations with you feeling really inspired and really hopeful. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. And I always feel the same way. I'm so thankful, one, that you are a dandelion, and two, that you are really focusing on shifting things, that, moving things from one place to another. It's one of my favorite things about you among many, many. So thank you for making the time.
Thank you.